Hello, everyone. Welcome to Chapter 9, Organizing the Body of Our Speeches. The chapter objectives that we will cover in this presentation will include explaining why it's important to organize our speeches clearly and coherently, identify 5 major patterns of organizing main points for our speech, and then discuss the guidelines for organizing our speeches. So like covering some tips and things we should keep in mind when developing our speeches, outlining our main points, and then lastly, discuss the 4 kinds of speech connectives and their role in our speeches. So let's go ahead and get started with why it's important to organize our main points. This is what we call strategic organization. And essentially, this is organizing our speech to achieve a particular result with a particular audience. So we know from previous lectures and chapters that our goal as speakers is to adapt our content, our speech, to fit the audience needs. And so by doing that, we take the strategic organization to our main points. So we organize our main points that are going to be most effective for producing that particular result for a particular audience. Part of strategic organization is it's really essential for effective public speaking. So if we don't organize our presentations coherently or clearly, we run the risk of losing the attention of our audience. And so in addition to just that main point, developing a clear, organized speech with the main points clearly organized helps establish critical thinking in 2 ways. First, it helps us establish critical thinking when we're developing our speeches. So it helps us to establish relationships between ideas. But secondly, it's really important for creating a very compelling speech. We want to show to the audience that relationship between our ideas. And the way that we primarily do that is by organizing our main points that fits that need. So let's go ahead and spend some time talking about main points, the main points within our speech. So this tends to be the most important and central feature of the body of our presentations. So within the bulk of our presentations, we'll spend a majority of the time discussing, explaining, fleshing out our main points. So speeches typically contain 2 to 5 main points. Anything beyond 5 points, we run the risk of confusing the audience, or the audience gets lost in our presentations. Sometimes as speakers, we even get lost in our presentations if we have too many main points, or the audience just gets tired of keeping track of our main points and they just mentally check out. So really, a good speech should contain 2 to 5 main points. Usually the rule of thumb is 3 main points, but we'll soon find out some organizational patterns that we might take for our speeches might lend well to different numbers of main points. And then main points should be organized strategically to achieve the speaker's purpose, as we stated previously. So let's move on to the most common organizational patterns that we can use in our speeches. Now, these aren't the only organizational patterns, but the book describes these as the most common. But I will present some alternative patterns, especially when we get into the persuasive speeches. There's a lot more we can do to enhance persuasion. But for this point in the semester, because we're working on some of the intro speeches and our informative speeches, these lend well for those types of speeches. So the first type of organizational pattern we have is the chronological pattern. Essentially, this is the time orientation pattern. So main points will follow some sort of time sequence. This could be either past, future, present. We see that things relating to history, if you're giving a topic about some sort of historical event, uh, oftentimes the chronological pattern will be useful in structuring your main points. And with these main organizational patterns, I'll give some examples after this slide of each one. The spatial pattern, this is essentially looking at things in terms of spatial proximities and the relationships between the main points. So essentially main points follow a directional pattern. So this could be anything that moves in a spatial order. So we could look at things from top down or down and up. So if you were describing, let's say, or informing us on the structure of Google, you might start from, up the higher, CEOs, and how does that organizational structure look, and how does it trickle down to, the everyday employee. Or we could look at things from side to side, or things from inside to outside, or outside to inside. And so again, I'll give some examples of these in just a minute. The causal pattern, this is not casual, it's the causal pattern. So when we think of causal patterns, we think of cause and effect relationships. So, maybe this event has caused this effect, right? So when we look at causal patterns, keep in mind that typically we'll take a linear approach to using causal patterns. So this is where we have, here's the cause, here's the effect. But we know that oftentimes there are cyclical patterns where we have these causal relationships. So, sometimes they call them feedback loops. In the introduction video, we talked about self-fulfilling prophecies. That was a causal cyclical pattern where we had cause, effect, cause, the effect produced another cause, and that cause created another effect, and that reinforced the initial cause of that effect. So just keep that in mind when you're exploring that pattern. We often see the problem solution pattern. The main points follow or shows relationships between a problem and viable solution or solutions. Now, typically with this, and also the causal pattern, these lend well to persuasive speeches. So if you're persuading us, maybe the problem solution, oftentimes we have to spend time persuading our audience that first the problem exists, and then also spend some time trying to persuade the audience why our solution is better than others. And so again, later in the semester, I'll share some creative ways we can approach persuasive speeches, especially when it comes to the problem solution pattern. The fifth one is the topical pattern. This is essentially where main points are divided into topics that really fall under a larger umbrella. So think of cancer. If you were going to inform us about cancer, we could break up that topic into specific types of cancer. But all of those subpoints or subtopics are consistent with that main point, which is cancer. So let's go ahead and take a look at the chronological pattern. Again, this is the time orientation pattern. So we could take past, present, future, or before, during, after type of approach. So if we are, let's say, given a speech on the history of Hawaii, we would organize our three main points theoretically in this structure. So maybe our first main point would be the Polynesian settlement in the 10th century. Okay. The second main point is the unification of Hawaii Islands, the Kingdom of Hawaii in 1779. And then the third main point would be joining the U.S. as the 50th state in 1958. So again, we see that when we are using a chronological pattern, depending on our topic, we might pick really predominant things that happened in history that give our audience an overview of our topic. The spatial pattern, this is again where we are looking at, we're structuring our main points in a directional pattern and the relationship with spatial proximity. So for this example, we're going to inform the audience about the structure of a hurricane. Okay, so we could, go from the outside to the inside, but for this speech example, we're going to be starting our speech at the center of the hurricane and moving outward. And this might be relevant to, maybe our friends, in Texas and the Gulf of Mexico who are being bombarded by hurricanes after hurricanes. So our main point might start out at the center of the hurricane, which is, a calm, cloud-free eye. And then surrounding the eye is the eye wall, a dense ring of clouds that produces the most intense wind and rainfall. And then rotating around the eye wall are large bands of clouds and precipitation called spiral rain bands. And so again, with this spatial organizational pattern, we're seeing that directional pattern from the inside, moving outside. Um, the causal pattern, so again, we talked about how causal patterns often take this cause and effect approach. And so here is an example of that causal pattern. So, our first main point is going to be the cause. The second main point will be the effect. So the first main point, the United States faces a growing shortage of trained nurses in all parts of the country. Okay, so there's the cause. The effect, if this shortage continues, it will strain the entire healthcare system, right? So again, with this, maybe our speech has two main points, right? The cause and the effect. And then under these main points is where we're going to really spend time fleshing out, these main points. So the United States faces a growing shortage of trained nurses in parts of the country. So under that main point, we might be answering questions, well, what's causing the strain or this shortage of trained nurses? Maybe it's, access to education. Maybe, our nursing programs aren't, equipping students for real practical world demands or, community demands. And then maybe in the effects, the shortage will continue. It'll strain the entire healthcare system. Then we might explore in what capacity or in what ways is it going to strain the healthcare system in terms of economic growth. What does that look like for us as individuals trying to get care and so forth. So again, these are just your broad main points, and then you're going to spend the rest of your speech fleshing them out. We see this problem solution pattern. So again, this organizational pattern will typically have two main points. The first main point, you're going to be discussing the problem. The second main point will be the solution. Keep it this way. Don't flip these main points. Don't start out with the solution and then talk about the problem. Logically, that doesn't lend well. So keep it, the first main point, talk about the problem. The second main point, what's the solution? So here's an example of this organizational pattern. The first main point, the problem, puppy mills are a serious problem across the US. The solution, solving the problem, requires legislation and individual initiative. So there we have the solution for that problem. We're going to have to require legislation, and then of course, individual initiatives, like what we can do as individuals to fix this problem. The topical pattern, once again, this is where we have a broad topic, and each of the main points might not necessarily relate to each other, but they all point to that main topic. And so, for example, this is a speech on Josephine Baker, right? And that's going to be the main topic of the speech, but our main points could look at various aspects of Josephine Baker. So this illustrates that organizational pattern. So the first main point, as an entertainer, Josephine Baker captivated audience in Europe and America. Okay, so you might talk about Josephine Baker as an entertainer. What? Josephine Baker was a spy? So, as a spy, Baker gathered information on Nazi activities in France during World War II. Wow, that's interesting. So we might spend some time talking about, activism and like, her affiliations with spying. And then third, as a civil rights activist, Baker worked for racial equality on a variety of fronts. And then again, we could discuss what that looked like and some context. But again, the idea is with this typical topical pattern, you have the main point, which is maybe a person, a place, a thing, a concept, and the main points are all related to that main point, but there might be various facets of that main point. So Josephine Baker was an entertainer, a spy, and a civil rights activist, and so we can see that transpiring. Okay, so main point tips. So when developing our main points for our speeches, keep the main points separate. So you want to make sure that you essentially categorize your main points. Keep them in separate categories. This will help you as a speaker remember your three main points, and also it'll help the audience stay on track of the progression of your speech. Keep or try for some pattern of wording. Try for the same pattern of wording. So, if you're going to say, my first main point is this, and you talk about your first main point, try keeping that my second main point, my third main point. So try keeping it balanced, try keeping the same pattern of wording. Again, this will help us remember our speeches. Balance time devoted to each main point. So don't spend, the bulk of your speech just discussing your first main point and then just briefly touching on your last two main points. So you want to balance the content between your main points, keep it well balanced. And then also support ideas with references or oral or verbal citations. And so for maybe each main point, consider using a reference or dropping a verbal citation. That way it backs up your ideas. So lastly, we will talk on connectives, and these are words or phrases connecting ideas. So there are a few different types that we could integrate into our speeches. The most notable, I think, is the transition statements or connectives. And these are statements that you're going to place between the introduction of your speech and the body, and then the body, between the body and the conclusion. So typically your speech are going to have two major transition statements, and that again is transitioning from the introduction to the body and then transitioning from the body into the conclusion. Now we can use minor transitions between our main points. So the last example, if we were talking about Josephine Baker as an entertainer, after we complete that idea, we might say something like, Josephine Baker was just not an entertainer. She was actually an amateur spy. The next thing that I would like to discuss with you is Josephine Baker's activities spying on the Nazi activities in France, during World War II. So it's a minor transition statement showing progression from your main point one to your second main point. Internal preview, these are essentially previewing subpoints. So within the main point of a presentation, you're going to probably have several subpoints. And so this internal preview will just preview those subpoints. So if we're, again, talking about Josephine Baker and her spy activity, we might say first, I'll discuss how she got involved in spying on the Nazis during World War II. Second, some of the things that she did in order to gather data or intel, and so forth. So you're just previewing those subpoints. And then we could also offer a internal summary. And so this is summarizing the subpoints that you just talked about. So, Josephine Baker was an amateur spy. She got into this because this and this, these were her methods of collecting intel. Now we'll move on to, you know, Josephine Baker as a social activist. So those are the internal summaries. Signposts are brief statements showing where a speaker is or focusing attention on key ideas. So oftentimes these will consist of numerical verbiage or language. So first, second, third are going to be the most effective signposts. So you could say first, you know, this is an issue. So puppy mills, for example, puppy mills are a huge problem in the US. Puppy mills are a problem first because X, Y, and Z. Puppy mills are a huge problem in the US because secondly, boom, boom, boom. You just, talk about it. Thirdly, they're a problem because this, and this. So those are connectives. So in today's brief presentation, we covered the importance of organizing main points clearly, discussing 5 basic organizational patterns, listed tips for organizing our main points, and explained the 4 types of connectives. So thank you so much for paying attention, for listening, and we'll see you next time.